Hello, my name is Dave, and I'm a high school science teacher. What we see here is the reason we've chosen to become professional educators. If there were no students, there would be no need for educators. Learners are at the very center of teaching, and this is the central thesis of this presentation. Since student learning is the goal of teaching, it stands to reason that teaching practices should result in effective student learning. Instructors and students have shared responsibilities. For too long, instructors have felt justified if they simply covered the curriculum. If the students didn't learn, then it was their fault. Well, it could be, but sometimes it's not. Instructors have a responsibility to teach in such a way that their students learn. Students have a responsibility to employ effective learning strategies. Research in neuroscience has illuminated the learning process. We have a better understanding of what goes on inside the brain during learning. This understanding will help both instructors and students meet their shared responsibilities. While the gross structure of the brain has been known, great strides have been made in understanding the human brain function at the cellular and neurochemical level. Of particular interest is the plasticity of the brain, the ability of the brain to change. It turns out that the brain has the ability to change throughout life. It's now known that structural changes in the brain occur when learning takes place. Neurons grow new structures known as dendrites, which then form new synaptic connections with other neurons to form new neural networks. This is the brain's physical manifestation of learning. The tender networks of new learning are weak, but they can be strengthened and made permanent. The bad news for the student is that this takes work or effort. This is not a surprise to us as educators, but it is an unfortunate reality for many students. Learning is hard work. This is where students often fail to meet their responsibilities. Learning is not a spectator sport. The one who does the work is the one who learns. Learner-centered teaching seeks to promote teaching practices that capitalize on the knowledge of how the learning takes place in the brain. This requires the transformation of student passivity to active engagement. If students are to learn and learning requires work, then it's them that must do the work. The responsibility to do the work of learning falls to the student alone. As we all know, the teacher cannot learn for the student, but the teacher can be a facilitator of learning, one who promotes active, engaging learning environments and activities. But there may be a problem. Many students are quite ready to continue to passively listen, perhaps take notes, take a test, and then forget it and move on to the next one. How can students be prodded to taking more active role in their learning? A few ideas include cumulative testing, or having students construct a collaborative review of material. A wiki site or a Google document could be used for this. Practice testing and quizzing also engages the student in the material prior to testing. Authentic learning is learning that reflects real-life work, activities, joys, and concerns. This piques the interest of students and justifies the student's effort to learn. Teaching that is detached from anything meaningful or useful to the student is not likely to be remembered for long. The challenge then is to construct lessons which tap into their need beyond a mere grade or fulfilling a requirement. Students need to grasp the relationship between what they are learning and its potential relevance to their life, or the world around them. Authentic learning mimics experiences students will encounter in their work, personal and professional lives after school or college. In real practice, problems are not normally neatly defined and limited in scope. Problems are often broad in scope, poorly defined, and without specific instruction toward a solution. Thus, authentic assignments should be longer term and include a degree of ambiguity, require students to seek out resources and collaboration of others. Assessment should resemble what is to come. This could include peer review as well as an application of rubrics based upon professional standards. Many professions and trades have understood and practiced this for years. Apprenticeship and internship programs afford this opportunity. Medicine, engineering, scientific research, and accounting are a few others that come to mind. The instructor is now a coach, a supporter, mentor, an enabler of learning, rather than a dispenser of information and answers. That's not to say that the instructor doesn't employ direct instruction, but rather only to the extent that it is needed. The trick is not to talk too much. This will require planning to shift from a teacher or lecture-centered model to a learner-centered approach. In order to activate a student's brain and form new neural connections, his or her brain's got to get to work. This requires new types of resources and assessments that require them to think and make connections on their own. This will take time to identify and/or author resources different from traditional lecture notes. In science, an example of an approach such as this is POGIL, Process-Oriented Guided Inquiry Learning. Some POGIL resources are available for purchase or can be used as a model to develop your own. Do not misunderstand the role of a facilitator. It's not an abdication of responsibility to teach students. This is not cutting them loose without direction to see what they come up with. As a facilitator, the task is to provide an environment which supports students such that they can do their best work. The goal is to get students thinking and doing their best. This requires as much expertise as ever, which is then applied so as to actively engage the student's brain. The strategy of transition to facilitator includes a writing of daily objectives, an action plan to achieve those objectives, supplying the students with needed practice, and providing meaningful feedback. Feedback is most effective when it is instructive and promptly delivered. Think of it as providing just enough information and just enough support to support the student in doing the work of learning. Provide a scaffold from which he or she can build. The more personable relationships we can form with students, the better. Notice that I said personable rather than personal. Remember that the relationship between instructor and student is a professional one. An awareness of issues such as learning styles enhances teaching by allowing for differentiation of instruction. It's been said that the most precious word to a person is their name. People want to be known by their name. To the extent that it's possible, know your students' names. Greet them. Converse with them. Carol Dweck, in her book Mindset, The Psychology of Success, summarizes a lifetime of work on the impact of a student's beliefs about their own intelligence and learning. Students with fixed mindsets believe that intelligence is basically a given quantity that cannot be changed. This manifests itself in student approaches toward learning. If intelligence is hardwired and can't be changed, then there's no use in putting a lot of effort into learning. Students with growth mindsets believe that intelligence can change. These students are much more likely to take charge of their own learning. They believe that with sufficient effort, they can learn, and they are much more willing to take academic risks. Since student effort is key to their learning, a student with a fixed mindset needs to be introduced to the possibility of a growth mindset. The growth mindset must lie at the heart of the willingness to endure enormous amounts of deliberate practice, as Colvin points out, perhaps 10,000 hours of deliberate practice in order to become experts in any field. In that people are social beings, it should not be surprising that learning is social in nature. Discussion takes advantage of this. When students participate in effective discussion groups, their level of cognition is higher. They scale the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid into areas such as analysis, application, synthesis, and creative problem solving. Because some students have grown up with many years of teacher or lecture-centered forms of teaching, some will be reluctant to accept discussion as a form of teaching and learning. Students should involve themselves in discussion groups because it taps into the social nature of learning and it mimics features of the student's future world of work. In this regard, the use of discussion intersects with authentic learning mentioned earlier. Students will buy in more if they have a say in things, if instructor power is shared. Encouraging students' input regarding the design and ground rules should lead to successful student groups. Discussion groups can have as their objective instruction in content, reflection, or analysis. Discussion competence, the ability to contribute and evaluate discussion, should also be a goal of discussion groups. We all acquire information through our senses. The different senses actually interact with one another. This is known as cross-modal interaction. So instruction that engages multiple senses results in more effective learning. Vision and smell are particularly important to retention and recall of information. Pictures or graphic information are especially memorable. All of this argues for a multisensory approach to learning, particularly incorporating graphics. This would seem that the multisensory approach relates to Gardner's multiple intelligences. The different channels of sensory input do have finite capacities. Think of them as roadways that can only carry a certain amount of traffic. Too much traffic makes for a traffic jam. So in lesson design, be careful not to include so much information that students get overwhelmed and frustrated and then shut down. We've all suffered from cognitive overload. Hopefully, this is not one of those times for you. A student's brain is looking for patterns in the information he or she is receiving. When patterns are learned, it's much easier for a student to remember and incorporate new information. Instructors that assist students in finding and using patterns see meaningful learning occurring. Patterns both reveal organization of subject matter and establish a cognitive organization for information. Compare two rooms that have the same things in them. One is a cluttered and chaotic mess. One is organized in a manner that's useful to the occupant. Which room's more efficient? Which can accommodate new items in a meaningful and retrievable way? When students recognize useful patterns, it also relieves them of much of the burden of memorization. No longer do they have a bucket of chaotic facts and information. They have a key to an organized cabinet. Students' brains, like ours, are flooded with more information than can be taken in. So there has to be a filtering process to identify what's worthy of attention. Call it selective attention. How this occurs is not clear, but what is clear is that attention is required for memory and coding. If students have any hope of learning, they have to be paying attention. Ultimately, memory and hence learning is manifested in the construction of neural networks. As these networks are used, they become strengthened and more robust. This is the neurophysiological basis for repetition and elaboration. In other words, practice. So there is a reason to give homework after all. Students need practice, to rehearse, to exercise, the circuits to make them stronger and more permanent. Don't mistake this for rote memorization. Good homework requires active thinking. This helps students retain what they are learning. Here are a few other good things to think about. Memory consolidation occurs during sleep, so a good night's sleep is essential to good learning. Naps help also. Stress detracts from learning. Aerobic exercise, 30 minutes a day, 4 or 5 times a week, also helps with effective learning. The neuroscience of learning has established the biological basis for active student engagement in learning, requiring adaptation of traditional teaching methods. As professionals, we are compelled to seek new ways to implement into our practice. We must implement into our practice the scientific understanding of the learning brain. Certainly we will meet with success and failure, satisfaction and frustration, but it is worth it. Earlier generations of professors and teachers were flying blindly, but now neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists are continuing to show us the biology of the learning brain. Aren't we obliged to use that information? Don't our students deserve it? Thank you.